Greetings everyone and welcome to THE621 Lecture 6B, where we're going to look at a couple other themes from the Gospel of Matthew. And this gives us a chance to look at some material, some sayings and passages that are unique to Matthew, and which together contribute to some topics and some themes that are clearly of special importance to Matthew in composing his Gospel. The two we're going to focus on today, and they overlap a bit, are ecclesiology and judgment. By ecclesiology, we mean the boundaries of the community and to some degree the structure of the community. Who leads? How does that leader or those leaders pass on the authority of leadership to others? And what are the boundaries? Who gets to be part of the community? Who is excluded? On what terms? How will that be sorted out? These are the sorts of things that were quite unclear for the early Christians after Jesus' death and resurrection. They obviously remembered and related the stories of Jesus gathering 12 special disciples to whom he gave all sorts of promises, including that they would be the judges of the 12 tribes of Israel. But they recognized that especially once the apostles had died, there had to be some sort of other structure and some way to figure out who was in charge. And for that, they looked to several passages in Matthew, which, as we'll see, were controversial because it's not entirely clear what direction they point. So let's take, in a sense, the granddaddy of them all in Matthew 16 to 19, where, just like in the Gospel of Mark, Peter acknowledges who Jesus really is. And in Matthew, from a narrative perspective, let me just note this is a wee bit different than it is in Mark, because in Mark, nobody has figured out that Jesus is the Christ, not even close. But in Matthew 14, the walking on the water scene is quite different in Matthew than it is in Mark. You should have a look at this because they're able, instead of in Mark where they just get confused and are terrified and don't want to ask him any more questions, in Matthew, the conclusion of that story is them saying, truly, you are the Son of God, which kind of makes you think when you get to Matthew 16, so what's so special about Peter's confession? But we'll leave that to one side. Jesus says, who do people say that I am? They give the various wrong answers, but Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Good answer, Peter. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Just want to note here, that's an intriguing statement because Jesus doesn't say simply, yeah, you guys know because you're my followers and other folks don't. He acts like, he suggests that the ability to perceive that he was the Christ was a gift of special revelation. And that's interesting. And it sort of relates to the fact that he doesn't speak of himself as the Christ, although he does think he is the Christ. He thinks it's something that can only be revealed by special revelation. To continue with the quotation, Jesus makes kind of a classic Old Testament style or rabbinic style play on words. I tell you, you are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, there are several questions that could arise here. One would be, what exactly is the nature of this pun? Because we're getting the pun in Greek. Jesus presumably was speaking Aramaic. But there's also the question of what kind of authority is he giving Peter? Is this an authority to bind and loose sins? We'll see that later in Matthew that looks like the interpretation Matthew gives to it. But binding and loosing in Jewish texts more typically means the ability to determine authoritative teaching, to bind a ruling or to undo a ruling. And there's the question that we'll get to in a moment of, if Jesus gives this authority to Peter, how unique is Peter and how much is Peter a representative of the 12 or perhaps even of any disciple? We'll come to all these questions in turn, but we'll start with the play on words. You are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. This is actually a lot more complicated than it might appear on the surface, but basically it helps to remind everyone that Peter, if you remember from Paul's letters, Paul speaks about Cephas, and that's simply the transliteration of the Aramaic Kepha, or something close to the transliteration of that. And Kepha is the Aramaic word for rock. That still leaves us wondering, so how did Jesus' play on words go? Because Peter has a name. His given name is the most common Jewish name in the Second Temple period, and that is Simon, Shimon. So did Jesus give him a nickname, Kepha, and then pun on the nickname? So he could have said, you, Simon, are going to be called Kepha. That's going to be your nickname, Rocky. It's not a normal name. It's a nickname. And on this Kepha, this new name I'm giving you, I will build my church. It's also, well, there's various other ways the pun could have worked. And partly what's confusing, and we won't get into it now, it's a relatively introductory class, is that in Aramaic, various Greek names had come in as loan names. So people were actually called Petros in Aramaic. So you could say in Aramaic, you are Petros, because that was a given name. And they just wrote the Greek name Petros in Aramaic letters. So there's various ways this pun could have worked, but we'll suffice it to say there's a new name. Jesus gives him a new name, and he derives some significance from that name. And this reminds us of all the times in the Old Testament that some important figure gets a new name, and God or another figure or a prophet derives some significance from that name. So we'll take as the classic example, and one that might be germane to Matthew, we'll take Genesis 17. Abraham. Remember, Jesus is introduced in the Gospel of Matthew as the son of Abraham. This is the great patriarch. Abraham used to be called Abram. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I'm going to make a covenant between me and you, and I will make you exceedingly numerous. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name will be Avraham, father of a great multitude. New name with a significance of that new name. It's related to the fact that God's making a covenant and going to make him very numerous. That very passage gets drawn on in later biblical texts. And here's what's kind of trippy. The passage gets drawn on in ways that play with the terminology of rocks. Take Isaiah 51. Listen to me, you that pursue righteousness, you that seek the Lord. Look to the rock, Greek Petra, from whom you were hewn. Look to Abraham, your father. In good Old Testament style, there is parallelism here. The rock from whom you were hewn is Abraham, your father, because all the Israelites are descended from Abraham. How interesting that the prophet is already calling Abraham a rock, a Petra. And what's really interesting is that rabbinic texts play on this passage and actually say, since the Holy One, blessed be he, foresaw that Abraham was going to come into being, this is before the creation of the world, God, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, behold, I have found the Petra on which to build the world. And he called Abraham Petros, as it is written, look to the rock from whom you were hewn. That is to say, there is a rabbinic text which actually talks about Abraham as the rock and uses the Greek word, this is written in Aramaic, it calls Abraham a Petra. All of which is to say there's a sort of punning on Abraham and rocks and new peoples already in the air. Some of it already in the Old Testament, some of it in rabbinic sources, which may post-date the Gospel of Matthew. And the relevance of Abraham as a rock has been drawn to our attention in Matthew, because what does John the Baptist say to the Israelites? He almost tells them, don't take Isaiah's advice. He says, do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as an ancestor. That is, don't just tell yourselves, hey, we're fine, we're Israelites, Abraham's our father. And I think John the Baptist is already punning on this tradition himself. He's thinking of Isaiah 51, Because he says, you know what? Yeah, Abraham may be the rock from whom you were hewn, but God can raise up new children from mere stones. You see that John the Baptist there is already speaking in a kind of quasi-rabbinic way, playing on words, and saying, yeah, look to the rock to whom you're hewn, but don't forget, God is the one who can do anything and can raise up children from any old stone. If we were to try to bring together these various observations to make sense of Matthew 16, maybe we could say something like this. Here's the similarity they share. At these critical junctures where God creates a new people or a new covenant or sort of admits people to the covenant, there's a change of names of one of the leaders. This happens with Abraham, and already that has built into it this rock terminology. So probably Jesus, or Matthew in telling the story, is doing a sort of midrash and saying, at the time for the people of God to be expanded and rebuilt and refounded, it's time for a new rock from whom God can raise up new children. Some of that may be in the background. And one thing to address here is that the John the Baptist saying, God can raise up children from mere stones, don't think Abraham matters so much. This gets taken in Christian history, in Christian theology, to induce what is called supersessionism. And that's the idea the old covenant is sort of torn up and God just makes a fresh one from scratch. Sorry, Israelites, sorry, Jews, it's a fresh covenant, you're out. There's passages like Matthew 21:43 that can contribute to that very view. So let's look at Matthew 21:43. Jesus says, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to the people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. That sounds like taken away from you Israelites and given to some new people, the Christians, the Gentiles largely, that produce the fruits of the kingdom. That sounds like supersessionism. But it's important to see that for Matthew, how does that verse continue? And when the chief priests and Pharisees heard this parable, they realized he was talking about them. I don't think it's fair to say Matthew is supersessionist. Matthew isn't saying, Israelites done, we're starting from scratch. Matthew is saying, current leadership of Israel is done, and we're going to start with a fresh leadership, a renewed people to whom others can be added. I hope that distinction isn't too subtle. There are passages in the New Testament, and probably the most striking are in the Gospel of John, which are, I think, just almost blatantly supersessionist. So I'm not trying to sweep under the rug the problematic passages, the ethically problematic supersessionist passages. This is a difficult topic that has to be dealt with some care, but I just want to say that Matthew is not a supersessionist. Let's come back to this rock business. What does it mean when he says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church? What's the rock? Well, there have been all sorts of proposals. They continue unabated to our own day. One is that the rock isn't Peter, but it's Peter's faith. It's the fact that he believed. So already in the early period, Ambrose, and this is popular especially in Reformation thinking, because they don't like the idea of, the Protestant reformers don't like the idea of a succession of authority coming from Peter. Others, already in the ancient period, imagine this was the truth revealed to Peter. So Jesus says, what it is you understood, that is your confession almost, that theological truth is the foundation of the church. Others still said Jesus must be talking about himself. You are Peter, and on this rock, by which I mean me, I will build my church. That's an old interpretation. It's important to see where it comes from. It really comes from 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul says there is only one foundation of the church, and the foundation is Christ. The church can't be built on any other follower of Jesus. As early Christians are trying to harmonize, Paul saying the church has to be built on Christ, and Jesus saying the church will be built on this Petra, they say, oh, well, he must be talking about himself. But I think if you have an honest look at Matthew 16:18, you really have to sort of twist the saying to get it to be where Jesus is saying, you are Peter, and on me, and I'm also a rock, I'll build my church. I think it's fair to say that the most straightforward interpretation is that Jesus is talking about Peter. And this seems to offend Christians of every possible stripe who don't like the idea that Jesus was giving some special role to Peter. But what else could the passage possibly mean? You are Petros, and on this Petra I'll build my church. The whole pun depends, all the more so in Aramaic, that this guy with this new name is going to be the cornerstone of this new community. That still leaves open a host of other questions, which in a sense Matthew's narrative addresses. So, the next questions I think we might ask would be, just to take one at a time. Okay, what kind of authority did Peter have? And was it transferable? So Jesus says, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind will be bound. Whatever you loose will be loosed. So what happens next? Peter was crucified in the 60s under Nero. What was supposed to happen after that? Well, one stream of Christian interpretation imagined that Jesus was giving unto Peter an authority which Peter could give to whomever he wanted. It was a transferable office. So to give an example, this is an apocryphal epistle of Peter to James. This is part of a sort of set of novels, early Christian novels, called the Pseudo-Clementines. Look at how this passage draws on the language of Matthew. I, Peter, was taught by the Lord and teacher Jesus Christ. I lay my hands upon Clement. Clement becomes Peter's disciple. Clement is, according to early tradition, the next bishop. I lay my hands upon Clement as your bishop, and I entrust to him my chair of discourse, that is, Clement is the authoritative teacher now. Wherefore I communicate to him the power of binding and loosing. So whatever he binds will be bound. In fact, whatever he ordains. That's interesting, because that means the epistle of Peter to James is interpreting that binding and loosing language. It thinks it means teaching authority. Whatever he ordains will be ordained. Well, I present this not to say this is the right interpretation of Matthew, but just to show this was one way Matthew got used. And to gesture to another point in the story, it's important to note that the Pseudo-Clementine literature is virulently anti-Pauline. So early Christians, as they read the Gospel of Matthew and as they read Paul's letters, they didn't read them as part of a single New Testament and say, these guys are all singing from the same hymnal. Some of them said, wait, who is this clown Paul who saw a vision one day and now thinks he's the boss? Peter got trained for years by the Lord. The Lord gave special authority to Peter. And what on earth was Paul thinking when he tried to resist Peter to his face, as Paul says in Galatians chapter 2? If we have to choose between Peter and Paul, that's easy. Peter was given special authority by the Lord. Paul wasn't. We go with Peter. So that's kind of the backstory of this Pseudo-Clementine literature and this imaginary letter of Peter to James. Although I have said just now that I think Jesus really is giving some sort of special authority to Peter, we need to let Matthew interpret himself in a sense. And Matthew has more to say about the apostles and the authority Peter gives to them. And one thing to notice is that we sort of need to ask, how unique is Peter? And when Jesus says, you are Petros and on this Petra, how much is Peter, in a sense there, being a representative for the 12? Notice a couple other passages. So I'm not just trying to twist that passage. Matthew himself, in chapter 18, where he really does his ecclesiological work, says, he uses this same binding and loosing language, but here it is applied to all, not to Peter. So it doesn't seem like Jesus is saying, remember, only Peter gets to bind and loose. Matthew 18 says, you, plural. As we say in English, y'all. Y'all can bind on earth, and whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. In another passage in Matthew, which helps show the point I'm trying to make. Matthew 26:40. Jesus says something to Peter. He addresses Peter by name, and yet he's not only singling out Peter. He's talking to Peter as a representative of the 12. Peter, are y'all not able to stay awake? Furthermore, just to drive this point home, Matthew does not think Peter is the be-all and end-all. Remember that in Matthew 14, Peter is unique in that when Jesus walks on the water, Peter gets out of the water and walks, but he does what? He does what rocks do. He sinks in the water. And everyone in Matthew 14 says, Jesus, you are the Son of God. It's not just Peter. Furthermore, I think this is really important for Matthew. Matthew is not all that keen on human hierarchy. So in material unique to Matthew, he says, you are not to be called teacher, rabbi. Matthew is written in just the period where rabbi is starting to become a technical term. And so whereas it always meant my great one, my teacher, it's starting to become something like an ordained position. And Matthew takes a look at that development in Judaism and says, not with us. No one will be called teacher. You have one teacher. You are all students. No one will be called instructor. You have one instructor, the Messiah. So I want to draw this sort of Peter analysis to a close and just point out a couple things. Matthew imagines Jesus ascribing special authority to Peter. He makes a pun on his name. That has deep and important resonances with Old Testament passages about Abraham's change of name and about Abraham being the primordial Petra on which God decided to build the world. That's not an accident. But at the same time, the Gospel of Matthew pictures Peter as, on the one hand, a representative of the 12, and even beyond that, as a representative of all followers, of all believers. In Matthew 18, we can see clearly what we might call this sort of communitarianism or egalitarianism, because in Matthew 18, Jesus addresses the most sensitive of all topics regarding ecclesiology, and that is, what do you do when someone is unrepentantly sinful? How do you go about excommunicating someone? And here, he provides a process. First, you rebuke someone individually, then 2 or 3 of you rebuke them, and then ultimately you bring them before the whole community. But if he refuses to listen to the community, the church, then you have to treat him like a Gentile and a tax gatherer. And here we get an echo of Matthew 16. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Which I think is Matthew's way of saying, the way you decide to set these boundaries will be boundaries that God honors. So kicking someone out is a big deal. Now, one thing just to note apropos of the question of hierarchy and authorities, this is a passage about kicking people out, and it never says anything like bring him to the teacher, or to the leader, or to the elders, or to the priests, or to the bishops. It just says a brother can rebuke a brother, that is a member of the community, a member of the community. And then there's 2 or 3. Why is this? Why does the community have this authority together? Well, it's a great Matthean theme. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am in their midst. What does that sound like? It sounds like at Jesus' birth, being told that Jesus will be called Emmanuel, because he is God's presence with them. Matthew 28, 19 and 20. Lo, I am with you always. The presence of Christ with the gathered community is an important theme for Matthew. The one other thing to note here is that this binding and loosing language is clearly being given the interpretation of the power to bind and loose sins. We see the same thing in the Gospel of John. If you forgive sins, they are forgiven before God. If you retain them, they are retained. That is, both Gospels, in their different ways, imagine that God, through Christ, has transferred the authority, the ability, to decide which sins are bound and loosed. Now, that should strike people as a sort of terrifying and horrible authority. Like, whoa, you mean the decisions people make will count in heaven about who's included and excluded? That's what these passages seem to say. And I think Matthew takes that very seriously, and note how Matthew structures this passage. Matthew 18:15 to 18, about the instructions for kicking someone out, are wedged in between. First, a passage where Jesus says, it's not God's will that any of these little ones should perish. In other words, keep in mind when you decide about kicking someone out that God doesn't want anyone lost. And then he tells this parable, which is only in the Gospel of Matthew, which really drives the point home. Do your best to forgive everyone you can. In this parable, the kingdom of God is like a king who wants to settle accounts, and they start bringing people in, and one person owes $1 bajillion, and the king says, well, tough luck, so sell him as a slave. And the slave says, oh, please have patience on me. And then this terrible situation just gets resolved. The king says, out of pity, you know what? I forgive you the debt. Never mind. And the whole problem's gone. But then as the parable goes on, it turns out that this slave had been forgiven this tremendous and unrepayable debt and been rescued from prison, ends up throttling one of his fellow slaves over some petty sum. And Jesus, as the parable teller, does not like it. So as the parable concludes, the Lord summoned this ungrateful slave and says, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt just because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? And the conclusion, Jesus says, is that the Lord handed him over to be tortured. So my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you don't forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Here's the warm and fuzzy Jesus of popular culture, reminding people that God will be very ruthless with anyone who is not forgiving. God is ready to forgive, but anyone who doesn't respond to that gift of forgiveness in kind will be called to account. My point here is that notice the way Matthew, to put that parable right after the instructions for how you excommunicate sinful members, kind of puts everyone in fear and trembling, and I think leaves everyone thinking, let's try not to lose any of these little ones, because the Lord said that would be bad. The other passage in Matthew, where it looks like Matthew has this question in mind of what to do with a mixed community. Another passage unique to Matthew along these lines is in Matthew 13, where the kingdom is likened to a field which has good plants and bad plants, the so-called parable of the wheat and the tares. And the devil has sown these tares, these weeds, and the question that gets asked within the parable is, shouldn't we pluck the weeds out? Like, why not? You want a field full of wheat. You don't want weeds. You should do what a farmer does. And the kind of unexpected answer is no. Let them grow together. Don't try to sort out the field ahead of time. God will sort out the field. You let it grow up together. I think the thrust of that parable kind of coheres with the general instructions you see in Matthew 18, which is to say, yes, there are some boundaries, but to the greatest extent possible, leave the sorting out to God. God is merciful to you. Do your best to be merciful to everyone else. All right, I'm sounding preachy, so I'll move along. There's another question we could put under ecclesiology, and that is what we could call the Gentile problem. Matthew concludes with the risen Jesus saying to his disciples, make disciples of all nations, Greek ethne, which is the normal word for Gentiles, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. The reason that should sort of startle us is that it's a reversal of what Jesus had been telling the disciples throughout the Gospel of Matthew. Namely, he tells them, don't give what is holy to dogs, and he spells out what that's supposed to mean. Don't go to the Gentiles. Only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The Canaanite woman recognizes that she is one of these dogs. Jesus says, you don't come to give the children's bread to the dogs. You don't give what's holy to the dogs. I'm here. I was sent only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. If it is the case that that was Jesus' policy during his ministry, that he did not want his followers going to Gentiles, but only to Israelites, what are we to make of the kind of remarkable reversal of course where Christians, believers in Jesus, did start going to Gentiles fairly early on? And although there was tremendous controversy about what the terms of Gentile admittance would be, that is, Christians fought bitterly over, do Gentiles, when they join our community, have to get circumcised and follow the Mosaic law? There was a lot of debate about that, but there actually doesn't seem to be any Christian voices saying, you know what, we shouldn't be going to these people. After all, the Lord told us repeatedly not to. How did they change course so drastically? Well, I guess the easy answer is the risen Christ told them to. And I don't really want to try to gainsay that answer, but an author like Matthew is going to have to find more. An author like Matthew isn't going to imagine that the Son of God was simply mercurial and changed course after his death and resurrection. Matthew is going to go back through the events of Jesus' life and figure out, why was it always part of God's plan that this new covenant community would include Gentiles, despite the fact, as Matthew faithfully records, Jesus didn't want nothing to do with them? Well, I think there's a few things Matthew draws attention to. There's easy ones, like there is the occasional good encounter with a Gentile, Matthew 8. About the centurion, Jesus says, I have not found such faith even in Israel. But of course, that doesn't change Jesus' opinion of Gentiles, because in Matthew 10, he's telling his followers not to deal with them. I think Matthew's kind of niftiest way of making sense of this is that Matthew finds hints in Scripture. Remember, Matthew is so saturated in the stories and scriptures of the Old Testament that he goes back through details of Jesus' life and says, it had to be this way. I'll give a couple examples. Matthew 4, a little detail, like the fact that Jesus of Nazareth went and dwelt in Capernaum. Why Capernaum? Matthew says, you know what? Capernaum is in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, two of the ancient tribal territories. And he realizes that where Jesus decided to grow up, that is in this town of Capernaum, happened to be in the ancient tribal territories about which there was a prophecy, land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. That's the quote from Isaiah. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. Those who sat in the region and shadow of death, a light has dawned. And he says, part of that prophecy was that a light would come to a land which happened to be a land of Gentiles. We'll expand on this sort of technique by Matthew. Matthew 12. Here Matthew is trying to address the very peculiar thing that Jesus kept telling everybody not to talk about himself. So Jesus ordered them not to make him known. Matthew goes to his usual device. Let's find a prophecy that explains that. And he's got a good prophecy from Isaiah 42. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. So why did Jesus say not to talk about me? Matthew's answer, the first servant song, Isaiah 42, says that his voice wouldn't be heard. He kept himself quiet. But notice this. Matthew sees added significance in the text from Isaiah that he quotes. He could have just ended his quote there. That's the germane part about him keeping himself quiet. But Matthew continues the quotation. Why? Because it also says about this servant, I will put my spirit upon him. He will proclaim justice to the nations, the Gentiles. He won't wrangle or cry aloud. No one will hear his voice. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick till he brings justice to victory, and in his name will the Gentiles hope. So the passage is directly relevant to Jesus' policy of secrecy and quietness, but there's more significance. This means he is the one in whom the Gentiles were destined to have their hope. Finally, I think there's a sort of shape to the narrative that When Jesus feeds the Israelites in the wilderness, there's leftovers. They gather up all this extra food. And just on the heels of that story, a Gentile woman says, I'm willing to eat the crumbs that fall from the table. And the conclusion you might draw is, well, if there's extra food, let's give it to the Gentiles. And Matthew makes that point clear with Matthew 22. The banquet was filled, well, the banquet was not fully filled, and therefore everyone had to be invited. As we've said in a prior talk, it's important to note that Matthew does think when the Gentiles get invited, they better come wearing their good wedding garb. So if I were to just speak frankly about Matthew's view of the Gentiles, it's a wonderful thing and part of God's grand plan that after the death and resurrection, Gentiles would be admitted to the community. But they better not show up in some sort of filthy garments. If they show up, they better behave themselves right. And that's consistent with, I think, a theme which we'll sort of conclude with, and that is that Matthew insists throughout Jesus was demanding, and he wants good behavior from people. And he says paradoxical things about the judgment. It's clear that Matthew expects that God is demanding and that people have to have a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees to be saved. At the same time, Matthew speaks extensively and extravagantly of God's forgiveness, of God's readiness to forgive. And it's hard to sort out how Matthew imagines those two themes fit together. To put in a nutshell two passages which sort of point in different directions, Matthew 7:21 in the Sermon on the Mount, which is incredibly demanding, Jesus says, look, even if you've done miracles in my name, and then you're going to come and say, Lord, Lord, anyone who doesn't do the will of my Father in heaven, I will say to that person, depart from me, you who do lawlessness, I never knew you. I will reject that I ever knew you. On the other hand, so saying achieves nothing. You get Matthew 10 where Jesus says, if you acknowledge me before others, I'll acknowledge you before my Father in heaven. So it's a matter of simply acknowledging and confessing. We could explore other themes that point in different directions. We get Matthew talking all the time, despite his insistence that Jesus will pay back to everyone according to their deeds. Matthew 12, Matthew 16. We also find him saying that you should pray for forgiveness and offering to people forgiveness all the time. You are like servants who've been forgiven. The Son of Man came to give his life as ransom for many. That is, my death will achieve forgiveness and ransom. My blood is the blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. So there's heaps of forgiveness and heaps of demands and heaps of warnings that there won't be any forgiveness of you if you don't forgive someone else. And if your righteousness isn't better than the very most righteous people in the society of that day, it will avail you nothing. How do you put that all together? I don't actually have an answer, but I want to continue to trace the themes a bit. From a sort of properly theological perspective, I think we can say Matthew's Jesus would insist God has the right and authority to do whatever God wants. And what God tends to want is to be generous. So a great example is the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where even as we hear it, it's sort of galling to think of the unfairness, the apparent unfairness, as people who hardly did any work at all get the same payment, the same reward as people who worked all day in the scorching heat. And the sort of striking and almost offensive conclusion of the parable is this master, that is the God figure, can do whatever he wants. Are you envious because I'm generous? And I think that Matthew wants his hearers to remember God may surprise us in the end and be a little too generous. And we would do well not to choke at that moment, not to be offended, because the first will be last and the last will be first. There are going to be some surprises. That's God's authority. The great depiction of the Last Judgment scene, we might think would help us sort of sort out how does judgment unfold. Matthew is unique in offering this very dramatic scene where people are divided, the sheep and the goats. And even here, there are some surprises. And maybe that's the theme we need to hold on to, is that Matthew says you don't know everything you need to know to calculate what the end and the judgment are going to look like. In this great parable, Matthew says, the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you." Why? Who gets this? We want to really listen carefully here. "I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Sick, and you took care of me. In prison, and you visited me." Now, the surprising part is that the righteous say, "Lord, when?" And I've abbreviated the quotation, but they don't recognize him. "When did we see you?" And he says, "If you did it for one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it for me." Conversely, people are surprised who are excluded, and they're told that they failed to take care of Jesus, and they say, "When was that?" And he said, "Well, whenever you didn't do it to one of the least of these." I think here there's a Christological mystery that Matthew is drawing on, and namely, Jesus is in all of the least, and failure to treat them right is failure to worship Christ. In other words, confession, acknowledgement, and conduct can't really be separated. To put it differently, the love of God and the love of neighbor are the twin commandments, and Jesus says they're the same. Why? Because humankind is created in God's image, and how people treat humankind is how they revere God. To quote an apocryphal saying, introduced by the 2nd century Christian Clement of Alexandria, he says that he thinks Jesus said, "Have you seen your brother? You have seen your God." To come closer to the Gospel of Matthew, we note that Matthew already, when sending out the disciples, tells them, "Whoever receives you receives me. Whoever gives you a cup of cool water to one of these little ones, they will not lose their reward for doing so." And for all of Matthew's demands and all of Matthew's strenuousness, and he tells very scary parables, Jesus does in Matthew, about how strict the judgment will be, he also insists throughout that the merciful shall obtain mercy. And I think Matthew 25 is his way of saying, I'm not trying to primarily induce fear, I'm trying to induce a character of mercy. Show mercy to others, and God will show mercy to you. Indeed, God started the ball rolling by first being merciful to you when you didn't deserve it. That doesn't resolve every saying in Matthew, and I think probably it's not that Matthew writes a very orderly and elegant and structured gospel. I don't think Matthew desires to give a systematic theological analysis of who gets saved and who doesn't. What exactly must one do? How much sin is too much sin for God? How much obedience is adequate? How much will confession avail? Matthew doesn't want to give those systematic answers. He circles around and treats them again and again with different themes and different parables. There's much more I would like to say about Matthew. We're going to move on to Luke in the next lecture, but we will come back to treat some other material from Matthew when we think about Jesus' eschatological discourse, which Matthew has preceding this final judgment scene.